Chapter 7. Check to Anti-Slavery on the Territorial Question 1783 to 1808 of Anti-Slavery in America, from the introduction of African slaves to the prohibition of the slave trade 1619 to 1808. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anti-slavery in America, from the introduction of African slaves to the prohibition of the slave trade 1619 to 1808 by Mary Stoughton Locke. Check to Anti-Slavery on the Territorial Question 1783 to 1808. Limitation of slavery by national authority was not seriously contemplated during the period now under consideration. There were no such stirring appeals for general emancipation as those of Samuel Hopkins and John Dickinson, which appeared in the years of Revolutionary War. The Confederation was too inadequate to its own problems to attempt to assert power in a question involving such additional difficulties. The Federal Convention, although anti-slavery speeches were not wanting, did nothing to restrict slavery, and it added to Constitution several distinct acknowledgments that slavery existed. The federal ratio of representation became a motive for the preservation and extension of slavery because, as Governor Morris said, it gave the slaveholder votes in proportion to his inhumanity. On the other hand, the federal ratio comprise led to a political jealousy in the free states, which found utterance in anti-slavery speeches and anti-slavery writings. Its existence intensified the feeling against slavery, and it came to be regarded as one of the reasons why slavery should be limited in territorial area. If it could not be altogether extinguished, so too the very weakness of the efforts for national emancipation due to the feeling that the regulation of slavery was a matter concerning the individual states and not a national affair left to anti-slavery sentiment the regulation of the territories as the only possible outlet for activity. Here, however, was a matter of distinctly national interest, and one which fell naturally into the hands of Congress, whose power in this direction was to be denied by the ingenious subterfuges of a later generation. And here was a promising field of action for the anti-slavery sentiment of the day. The Western Land Cessions from New York 1781, Virginia 1784, Massachusetts 1784, and Connecticut 1786 necessitated national regulation of the territory which was now the national domain, and the lands in the southwest were likely soon to follow. In this vast region, then, the opponents of slavery at once perceived the desirability of establishing free institutions. The first proposal, originating with Thomas Jefferson in 1784, was intended to prohibit slavery in the whole region west of the Alleghanies after the year 1800. This provision failed for lack of a single port, for it was substituted that of Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which provided for the abolition of slavery but applied only to the territory north of the Ohio River. Even this arrangement was executed with difficulty. After the admission of Ohio to the Union, Indiana Territory was impatient to obtain a population sufficient for the formation of state governments and clamored for permission to retain slavery for a limited term in order to attract slave-holding immigrants. A committee of Congress, of which John Randolph was chairman, made a report on March 2, 1803, decidedly adverse to the petitions. The committee declared that they deemed it dangerous and inexpedient to suspend the prohibition, that the rapid settlement of Ohio showed that slavery was unnecessary, that slave labor, demonstrably the dearest of any, could only be employed to advantage in the cultivation of the most valuable products, and that the prohibition was necessary in order to give security and strength to the frontier. The agitation, however, continued, and a suspension of the article for 10 years was nearly carried. South of the Ohio River, slavery was quietly permitted to continue and increase. For the lands west of Virginia, no special provision was made, as Kentucky entered the Union as a slave state in 1792. The North Carolina cession, accompanied by condition that Congress should not apply the anti-slavery principles of the Northwest Ordinance, was the occasion of some debate, and an amendment was proposed and discussed but not adopted on the organization of the Mississippi Territory 1798. A motion was made in Congress touching the rights of man to strike out of the clause by which a prohibition of slavery like that of the Northwest Ordinance was to be omitted. This motion aroused considerable debate and gave an opportunity for the anti-slavery sentiment of Massachusetts and Pennsylvania to declare itself, and for Virginia to give evidence of her declining interest in emancipation and her desire for new fields for her laborers. This debate is a forerunner of that on the Missouri Compromise. The condition of the slaves would be ameliorated, thinks Mr. Giles of Virginia, by spreading them over a wider area. It's not for Congress, says his colleague Mr. Nicholas, to attempt to make a particular spot of country more happy than all the rest. If slavery, he adds, is a misfortune to the southern states, would it not be doing a service not only to them but to the whole country to spread the Negroes over a larger area, so that in time it may be safe to effect their emancipation when the territory is ready to form a state government? He argues, then its own legislature can, if it wishes, take measures for emancipation, and perhaps by that time other states will be in a position to join it. Against the weak optimism or insincere philanthropy of Virginian congressmen stood Albert Gallatin of Pennsylvania and Messrs. Thatcher and Varnum of Massachusetts. Slavery, says Mr. Thatcher, is an acknowledged even by slaveholders to be an evil. It has on former occasions been so described by gentlemen from Virginia himself. Even if it is impracticable to liberate the slaves of the southern states on account of their great numbers, it is practicable to prevent the further extension of this evil in the new territory. This is moreover the duty of the government a duty arising from the very foundations of the government itself. The government, says Mr. Thatcher, originated from and was founded on the rights of man, upon which ground we mean to protect it, and could there be any propriety in emanating a government from ours in which slavery is not only tolerated but sanctioned by law? Certainly not. This is a critical moment in the history of the new country, and the responsibility of the government and the dangers of delay are distinctly pointed out by that clear-headed and far-sighted statesman Albert Gallatin. If this amendment is rejected, says Gallatin, we establish slavery for the country not only during its temporary government but for all the time it is a state. For by the constant admission of slaves, the number will increase to a certain degree, and when territory shall become a state, the interest of holders will procure a constitution which shall admit of slavery, and it will be thereby made permanent. By another speaker, the prosperity of the Northwest Territory and the high value of the lands there are urged as evidences of the advantage of the prohibition of slavery. If the southern states could get clear of their slaves, says Mr. Varnum, the price of their land would immediately double. As for the moral aspect of the question, he looked upon the practice of holding blacks in slavery in this country to be equally criminal with that of the Algerines carrying our citizens into slavery, a remark deeply resented by Mr. Rutledge of South Carolina. The chief arguments against the prohibition of slavery were based on the rights of property and, as already mentioned, the desirability of extending slavery and thereby ameliorating the conditions and making ultimate emancipation possible. To these, it was replied that the prohibition in the Mississippi Territory would not affect the peace or property of other states any more than did the prohibition already existing in the northern states and the Northwest Territory. As for those already holding slaves in Mississippi Territory, they might, as under the terms of the Northwest Ordinance, continue to hold slaves for a limited period, even if the property of some individuals were injured, declared the uncompromising Mr. Thatcher. The government still had a right to take all due measures to diminish and destroy the greatest of evils. For he never could be brought to believe that any individual can have a right in anything which goes to the destruction of our government, viz., that he can have a right in a wrong. A property in slaves is founded in wrong and never can be right. As for the extension of slavery in order to mitigate its evils, if the southern states were determined to keep slaves, he wished only they should be plagued with them. The debate gave an opportunity for the opponents of slavery to air their sentiments. It is noticeable that but few took part in the discussion, and that when the question was put to vote, the amendment in favor of limitation of slavery had but 12 in its favor. Thus, a compromise was practically agreed upon by which the Ohio River became the dividing line between the free and slave states of the West. While the fate of both the Northwest and Southwest territories was by 1808 virtually decided, a new element entered into the controversy in the annexation of territory west of Mississippi River. At first, the question of slave trade was raised, and here, supported by the votes of Virginia, Congress took a decided stand against the importation of slaves from foreign ports. The question of the prohibition of slavery also received some attention, more than had been bestowed upon its exclusion from Mississippi Territory. The slavery problem was one of the grounds of the Federalist opposition to the new acquisition, and memorials and other anti slavery literature indicate that the question was considered a critical one. A memorial was addressed to Congress by the American Convention for promoting the abolition of slavery, presented Jan 23, 1804, praying that the introduction of slaves into the new territory might be prohibited and suggesting a provision like that of the Northwest Ordinance. It was urged that slavery had been entailed upon the country by our ancestors, and that many people now recognized the evil but felt the difficulty of getting rid of it, and Congress was implored, for the honor of the country and the welfare of posterity, to preserve the new territory from similar calamities. The memorial was followed a year later by one of the yearly meeting of the Society of Friends in Philadelphia, presented January 21, 1805, praying that effectual measures may be adopted by Congress to prevent the introduction of slavery into any of the territories of the United States. Both memorials were referred in the House to committees on the government of Louisiana Territory, but the whole region, without regard of latitude, was finally granted the privileges of Mississippi Territory instead of those of the Northwest. March 2, 1803. The District of Columbia was another point of attack which was not left to the later abolitionists to discover. As early as 1804, a movement in this direction was suggested by John Parrish in his remarks on the slavery of the black people. After a protest against the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, he says, and as it, as it is manifest that Congress supposed they had a right to make laws to oppress this description of the great family of mankind, which is apparent by the aforesaid law, I apprehend there can be no doubt of their authority, if not in other places, at least in the District of Columbia, to prevent some of those evils this degraded part of our fellow men were groaning under. And where could it begin better than the seat of government? Early following year, January 18, 1805, a resolution was introduced in the House of Representatives by James Sloan of New Jersey to the effect that after July 4th of that year, all blacks born within the District of Columbia or born of a mother belonging to a resident of the district should be free at a certain age. The resolution was rejected by a vote of 31 to 77, but another entering verge had been introduced. With all its incompetences, the political movement of this period marks a distinct advance in the cause of universal liberty, both in the work of voluntary associations and in the attitude of the state. It is noticeable that the principal elements of the later movement are all present, and the foundations for the later work firmly laid. The organization and work of the abolition societies, the orations, address, pamphlets, and pictorial representations, the work in the court and legislature, the presentation of petitions, and the advocacy of the right of petition, the endeavor to exclude slavery from the Western territories and from the District of Columbia, and the concern about fugitives, kidnapping, and the foreign and domestic slave trade are all more or less conspicuous in this movement. Though the actual work was but half accomplished, at least precedents were set and traditions established which were an inspiration and an example to the later age. Two other gains for the gain of the freedom may also be noted. The first was that the importation of slaves had been prohibited by law, never to be revived except in a clandestine trade. Though the Act of 1807 was inefficient and government lax in its execution, the establishment of the principle is of no slight importance as a check to the trade and support to the opponents of slavery. In the second place, provision for emancipation has been made in all states of Mason and Dixon's line and the country north of Ohio River, and a sectional division had thus been established on the slavery question. A solid South had been left to slavery, but the solid North was to be free. The development of national feeling would cause men again and again to lay aside anti slavery scruples for the sake, as they thought, of preserving the Union, and even in 1861 it was love for the Union, not hatred of slavery, that roused the North to arms. But the energetic protest against the Dred Scott decision in 1837 testifies to another conviction, best voiced by Lincoln in 1858. The system of compromises inaugurated by the Federal Convention could only delay the inevitable. In the South slavery might flourish and extend itself to the degree undreamed of by the fathers of republic. The northern states might shut their eyes and cry, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Even in the north slavery might die a lingering death, but the free states, with such a history behind them, could never again allow slavery to gain a foothold upon their soil. If the Union must become either all slave or all free, it was slavery that was doomed. End of chapter 7. Check to anti slavery on the territorial question 1783 to 1808. Read by Prasanth on December 4th, 2021 from Hyderabad, India.
Section 16 of Anti-Slavery in America, from the Introduction of African Slaves to the Prohibition of the Slave Trade, 1619 to 1808. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anti-Slavery in America, from the Introduction of African Slaves to the Prohibition of the Slave Trade, 1619 to 1808, by Mary Stoughton Locke. Anti-Slavery Literature After the Revolution, 1783 to 1808. The series of parallel movements which have been described in the preceding chapters was accompanied by an anti-slavery literature, more abundant and more varied than that of any previous time. There is comparatively little which is directly connected with the political movement, since that was accomplished chiefly by petitions and resolutions, and by work in court and council which was of a practical, rather than a literary, character. A few memorable speeches were made, such as those of William Pinckney, David Rice, and Theodore Dwight, which have already been described. Footnote 1. The addresses of the American Convention of Delegates of the Abolition Societies have also been mentioned in connection with the political movement. Footnote 2. But the great bulk of the literature of this time has no such definite political purpose, and yet is of considerable importance as an expression of anti-slavery sentiment, and an element in the formation of public opinion. No one who studies this literature can fail to be struck by the likeness of the arguments and methods to those of the later anti-slavery agitation. In the first place, the abolitionists were quick to make use of a new medium, the literary magazines which now began to spring up in the United States. Like most of the anti-slavery literature of the time, the magazine articles lack the simplicity, directness, and force which characterized the earlier writings. They are filled with weak sentiment and florid rhetoric. But these are faults of the period, and it would be as unfair to consider the feeling insincere, because of the attempt to clothe it in the fine language which was considered requisite to the occasion, as it would be, on the other hand, to consider that the coarse attacks upon President Jefferson in Denny's Portfolio were prompted by pure anti-slavery sentiment rather than by party virulence. Footnote 1. See above, sections 128, 131, 137. Footnote 2. See above, sections 117 to 119. The sentimental type of magazine article may be illustrated by an address to the heart on the subject of American slavery, in which the African is described as reclining in the arms of balmy rest on a couch of reeds and smiling at the innocent gambols of his children. All sorts of festive joys abound, and innocence and virtue reign. Then come flames and shrieks and clanking chains, the desert march, the rolling sea, and the devouring monsters of the deep, until at last the survivors are brought to the fathers of oppression in the West, whose flinty hearts regard them as beasts of burden. Footnote 1. Tales are related, one of them a continued story running through a year's issue of the American Museum, illustrating the exemplary virtues of dark-hued heroes and heroines and describing their tragic fate. Footnote 2. The magazine literature also includes anecdotes, such as the clever retort of a Negro whose master has been preaching on liberty, and of another arrested for buying stolen goods. Footnote 3. Travelers' descriptions of the condition of the slave states, as compared with the free, are occasionally inserted, and the reviews of books of travel notice and comment on the subject. Footnote 4. Anti-slavery poetry also appears occasionally. This is usually intended to be either humorous or pathetic, but in general, the humorous verses are dreary and the pathetic ones are funny. Not all of the current literature, however, is of so light a character. In the American Museum are several essays on Negro slavery, one of them by A Free Negro, footnote 5, and two others of unusual vigor, signed by Othello, footnote 6. Extracts from addresses and orations are also given, footnote 7, and during Jefferson's administration there is considerable literature of a semi-political character, consisting chiefly of attacks on the professions of the Republican Party. Footnote 1. Address to the Heart, on the subject of American slavery, in the American Museum, 1, 465 to 468. Footnote 2. The Negro equaled by few Europeans, translated from the French by Phyllis Wheatley, in the American Museum, volumes 9, 10, January to December, 1791. Footnote 3. The American Museum, 10, 28, 7, 332. Footnote 4. The Monthly Anthology, 1806, The Portfolio, 1806 to 1807. Footnote 5. A Free Negro, Letter on Slavery in the American Museum, 6, 7 to 80. Footnote 6. Othello, Essays on Negro Slavery, in Ibidem, 4, 414 to 417, 509 to 512. Footnote 7. Speech of an American Quaker on African Slavery in Ibidem, 4, 173. J.P. Martin, Rights of Black Men in Ibidem, 12, 299 to 300. Extract from an oration delivered July 4th, 1793, by the Reverend William Rogers in Ibidem, 7, 255. Extract from an oration delivered by Mr. William Winnington in Ibidem, 12, 191 to 196. Jefferson's remarks on the natural inferiority of the Negro, footnote 1, are severely commented on, footnote 2, but it would be difficult to say how much of the criticism is inspired by anti-slavery sentiment and how much by political rancor. The partisan spirit appears more distinctly in connection with a poetical description of the woes of the slave, which is introduced by a sarcastic editorial, commenting on the instruction of the Negro in the beautiful Republican theory of equality amid the wholesome exhalations of a rice plantation, and advising the author of the poem to dedicate it to Mr. Jefferson. Footnote 3. Another author, with some geographical inaccuracy, alludes to the rice swamps at Monticello as the favorite haunt of philosophy, liberty, and other French fairies. Footnote 4. The development of the political antagonism to slavery at the same time with the development of the sentimental style, although it leads to a suspicion of mixed motives, had, after all, a certain value. It gave a more manly and healthful tone to the literature, just when it was most needed. Without this prejudice, the maunderings of the sentimental tales and select poetry would be vapid indeed, and the magazine literature would be worth little consideration. For this reason, the Portfolio, the less decidedly anti-slavery in its character than the American Museum, is a suitable successor and serves to carry on the work. The influence of political conditions, though not so marked as in the Revolutionary period, is still great. Elsewhere than in the magazines, both the sentimentalist and the political partisan are less conspicuous, and the anti-slavery spirit usually reigns undisputed whenever it appears at all. But, as in the magazines the sentimentalist of the early constitutional period gives way to the political partisan of Jefferson's administration, so the mild, optimistic essayists and orators, such as Dana and Swift, Rogers and Whittington, are followed by a more vigorous and even violent type, stimulated by political conditions, and especially by the development of party politics on somewhat sectional lines. These facts do not in any way indicate a progressive or systematic anti-slavery movement. Footnote 1. See above, section 50. Footnote 2. See below, section 190. Footnote 3. The portfolio for 117, 118 to 119. 4. Ibidem 150. There were isolated instances all the way along of uncompromising hostility to slavery, and there is little ground for judging whether the sentiment which they represent was more or less general at the end of the period than at the beginning. The differences to be noticed in the character of the literature are the effects of the political conditions in their relation to slavery, rather than of any change in the sentiment itself, and the less hopeful tone and more vigorous denunciations of the latter writers indicate the natural reaction of a spirit which had hoped all things from the rising republic, and had waited in vain for the fulfillment of its hopes. The careful readers of the anti-slavery argument of this time must admit that, like that of the Garrisonians, it spared neither the prejudices nor the fears of the South. There was, to be sure, a difference of opinion, even among the most single-minded, as to the most effective methods of educating public sentiment. One orator speaks of the specious enemies of freedom, who profess to acknowledge the wickedness of slavery, but use every artifice to continue it, under pretense of expediency. Footnote 1. Another alludes to the intemperate zeal of the immediate abolitionists, who will counteract their own purposes and make the condition of the slaves worse than before. Footnote 2. That these immediate abolitionists were always to be reckoned with is indicated by the attitude of Southern congressmen, with their suspicion of entering wedges and their continual expectation of some further move against their peculiar institution. Footnote 3. There was said to be as much anxiety over a question affecting slavery in any degree as if the debate were upon its abolition. Footnote 4. The fear of an invasion from St. Domingo, accompanied by an insurrection of the slaves in the South, which gave occasion for special congressional legislation in the session of 1797 to 1798, as well as for some of the state legislation of this decade, Footnote 1, was increased by the feeling that in case of such an insurrection, northern states would give their aid reluctantly, if indeed they would not fan the flame. Footnote 2. Footnote 1. Dwight, Oration before the Connecticut Society for the Promotion of Freedom, 21. Footnote 2. Webster, Effects of Slavery on Morals and Industry, 34. Footnote 3. See the speeches of Mr. Smith of South Carolina in Annals of Congress, 4th Congress, 2nd Session, 1731, and elsewhere as noted in previous chapters. Also, the speeches of Mr. Williams of South Carolina and Mr. Baldwin of Georgia in Ibidem, 5th Congress, 2nd Session, 1963-1969. Footnote 4. Ibidem, 5th Congress, 1st Session, 664. Speech of Mr. Bayard. Footnote 5. Ibidem, 5th Congress, 3rd Session, 2752. See also 6th Congress, 1st Session, 267 to 268, 276 to 277, 7th Congress, 2nd Session, 156-194. Nor can it be denied that the language of some of the abolitionists furnished ground for these apprehensions. Slaves, says Theodore Dwight, quite openly, having been brought into our society by force, without taking part in the social compact or in legislation, form no part of the social body, and therefore cannot justly be the object of laws. No custom and no law, he declares, which a state where slavery is practiced, either has made or can make, ought to affect the enslaved Negroes at all, unless designed as a partial compensation for the injuries which they have suffered, injuries for which all the wealth of man can never atone. As for slave insurrections, he considers that, if defensive war is susceptible of justification in any possible instance, this is that instance. The same law which justifies the enormities committed by civilized nations when engaged in war will justify slaves for every necessary act of defense against the wicked and unprovoked outrages committed against their peace, freedom, and existence. Footnote 3. David Rice of Kentucky, in a similar spirit, speaks of the blacks of St. Domingo as the brave sons of Africa engaged in a noble conflict with their inveterate foes. fired with a generous resentment of the greatest injuries, and bravely sacrificing their lives on the altar of liberty. Footnote 4. Another sympathizer compares them with the patriots of 1776, asking, "Is not their cause as just as ours?" Footnote 5. The fate of their exiled masters is even described by Dwight as a dispensation of providence which humanity must applaud. Footnote 6. Another, St. Domingo, is prophesied for the continent, and, in this event, it is thought the Almighty will be implored in vain to give his aid to the oppressors. Footnote 7. As for human assistance, where shall they, the inhabitants of the southern states, look, says Dwight, for auxiliaries in such an iniquitous warfare? Surely no friend to freedom and justice will dare to lend them his aid. Footnote 1. Footnote 1. Dubois, Suppression of the Slave Trade, 70-73. Footnote 2. Annals of Congress, 9th Congress, 2nd Session, 626-627. Footnote 3. Dwight, Oration before the Connecticut Society, 11-13. Footnote 4. Rice, Slavery Inconsistent with Justice and Good Policy, 9. Footnote 5. J.P. Martin, Rights of Black Men, in the American Museum, 12-299. Footnote 6. Dwight, Oration before the Connecticut Society, 19. Footnote 7. Brannigan, the Penitential Tyrant, Notes, 147-148. The political claims which they will have upon us, says another, will be opposed by the claims and the remonstrances of conscience. Footnote 2. And still another writes, as slavery is generally reprobated in the northern states, the people would go more reluctantly to lend their aid in such a contest than in any other, because it would, in effect, be upholding what they know to be wrong in itself. Footnote 3. The suggestion that slavery might lead to the breaking up of the Union belongs also to this period. Such a separation was probably apprehended by a few far-sighted statesmen at the very foundation of the Republic, and the sectionalizing of party politics made such a catastrophe still more imminent. The Federalists were particularly exasperated by the professions of liberty and equality made by the opposite party and by the charges of aristocracy brought against themselves. Those, said James Bayard of Delaware, are the real aristocrats who have been habituated from infancy to trample on the rights of man. When I see these high priests of liberty so zealously proclaiming freedom on one hand, while on the other they are riveting the chains of slavery, I cannot forbear tearing aside the veil. Footnote 4. We are shocked, writes a correspondent of the Connecticut Courant, in more violent language, to hear reverential ideas of liberty and equality, uttered by mouths worn smooth with curses against their fellow men who blacken all the surrounding territory. Who does not abhor the hand professedly raised up to check the progress of aristocracy in the land, when its fingers are stained with blood, drawn by the scourge from the veins of a slave? Who will give any credit to a man for sincerity, when in one moment he breathes forth enthusiastic praises of liberty, and the next, like the Bohan Upas, sheds poison and death all around him? Footnote 5. The federal ratio of representation and the annexation of Louisiana were also sources of discontent, partly from jealousy of the political power of the South, and partly from sincere scruples against slavery, and it was more directly in these connections that the separation of the Union was contemplated. Footnote 1. Dwight, Oration before the Connecticut Society, 19-20. Footnote 2. Pelham Letters, No. 2, in the Connecticut Courant, December 12, 1796. Footnote 3. Letters of Gustavus, No. 3, in Ibidem, August 28, 1796. Footnote 4. Annals of Congress, 5th Congress, 2nd Session, 1229. See also 3rd Congress, 2nd Session, 1039-1043. Compare Aminto, Reflections on the Inconsistency of Man, 9-15. Footnote 5. Pelham Letters, No. 2, in the Connecticut Courant, December 12, 1796. Of the feeling on the federal ratio, the letters of Pelham and Gustavus, which appeared in the Connecticut Courant in 1796 and 1797, though violent and overdrawn, may be taken as an illustration. Negroes, says one of the writers of these letters, are in all respects, except in regard to life and death, the cattle of the citizens of the southern states. If they were good for food, the probability is that even the power of destroying their lives would be enjoyed by their owners, as fully as it is over the lives of their cattle. It cannot be that their laws prohibit the owners from killing their slaves because they are human beings, or because it is regarded as a moral evil to destroy them. If that were the case, how can they justify their being treated in all other respects like brutes? For it is in this point of view alone that Negroes in the southern states are considered in fact as different from cattle. On what principle, then, were they noticed among their masters in the scale of representation? Footnote 1. Of the annexation of Louisiana, David Humphreys, in a valedictory to the Cincinnati, July 4, 1804, says, after enumerating various political objections, "And, what is infinitely more pernicious, it cannot be cultivated to advantage without the introduction of great numbers of Africans, an abomination sooner or later, I fear, to be expiated in blood." After remarking on the species of republicanism which will characterize their fellow citizens in the newly acquired territory, the orator suggests that every candid person must also be left to judge for himself whether this event will be likely to contribute to the preservation or destruction of the Union. Footnote 2. The possibility of separation was not only suggested, but elaborately discussed in the series of papers by Pelham and Gustavus, and among the arguments in favor of separation, slavery is conspicuous. Footnote 1. Pelham Papers No. 1 in the Connecticut Courant, November 21, 1796. Footnote 2. D. Humphreys, a valedictory discourse delivered before the Cincinnati of Connecticut, 26. The existence of slavery, says Pelham, may be viewed as one forcible cause of a final separation of the United States. The extreme wickedness of holding our fellow men in chains, merely to serve our own interested plans, is very generally acknowledged in the northern states, and the sentiment is steadily gaining ground. How can the hands of men, accustomed to do to others, as they would that others should do to them, clasp in the fraternal embrace those who brood over misery and blood, who smile at murder and ridicule despair? Footnote 1. Division is inevitable for both political and moral causes, is the argument of Gustavus, and the sooner it takes place the better. For if division is postponed until the opposition becomes more virulent, as it certainly must from the nature of the causes of opposition, the friction, between separation is accomplished, will involve the country in civil war, whereas if the division is soon brought about, it may be effected without bloodshed. Footnote 2. Independently of party politics, the most radical of the anti-slavery writers of this period are to be found either in connection with the movement for emancipation in the states, as in the case of Theodore Dwight and David Rice, or soon after the annexation of Louisiana and the repeal of the South Carolina Prohibition. The two former agitators have been frequently mentioned. Of those stimulated to action by the South Carolina repeal, the most conspicuous are Thomas Brannigan and John Parrish, men of very different types, but both remarkable for their earnestness of purpose and their appreciation of the vital importance of the slavery question. Thomas Brannigan, the penitential tyrant, or slave trader reformed, represents to some degree the type of reformed slaveholder, later to be so manfully represented by John G. Birney and Cassius M. Clay. At the same time, he is the man of one idea, represented in the earlier time by Ralph Sandiford and Benjamin Lay. He was born in Dublin, Ireland, in 1774. At the age of 13 he went to sea, but as he approached manhood, he became convinced that privateering was no better than piracy, and left the service. Footnote 1. Pelham Letters No. 2, in the Connecticut Courant, December 12, 1796. Footnote 2. Letters of Gustavus in Ibidem, August 14, 21, 28, and September 11, 1797. He then became overseer on a plantation at Antigua, but gave up this position also from conscientious scruples, and went to Philadelphia. The cruises of his youthful years had made him acquainted with the slave trade, and his experience on the coast of Africa and on the West India plantation led to a conviction of sin, which forced him to write a confession of his deeds. He also felt bound to make what compensation he could, by trying to convince others of the iniquity of slavery, and warning them of the fate which awaited the slaveholder and the nation unless the evil were abolished. Footnote 1. Although when he began his career as an author, according to his own account, he did not know what a note of admiration, a note of interrogation, or quotation marks meant. Footnote 2. He did not allow his ignorance of punctuation to set limits to the ambition of his style. 2 epic poems of several cantos each are written in the style of Homer and of Pope. Footnote 3. But his frank avowal of illiteracy, tautology, and servile imitation disarms the critic, and the honesty of his purpose makes up in some degree for the tediousness of his lines. Avania, the earlier of these poems, is preceded by a preliminary essay announcing its preparation and calling for subscribers to defray expenses. The call was responded to by a considerable number of subscribers, chiefly, if not all of them, citizens of New York and Philadelphia. Footnote 4. Avania is a tragic tale beginning with the innocent joys of Africa, which are soon disturbed by the arrival of the slave trader, and ending with the suicide of the heroine on account of the brutal treatment of her master. Footnote 1. Brannigan, Compendious Memoirs, in The Penitential Tyrant, 1-38. Ibidem, a preliminary essay on the oppression of the exiled sons of Africa, 9-28. Section 2. Ibidem, The Penitential Tyrant, Notes, 144. Footnote 3. The motive of the penitential tyrant is thus expressed in the opening lines. Awake, my muse, though sorrowful to name, the crimes of baptized infidels proclaim, their complicated villainies explore, from Afric's golden coast to India's shore. Sing Adam's exiled sons, by them oppressed, with grief, despair, and mighty woe depressed. Footnote 4. Ibidem, a preliminary essay. Advertisement 5-8, and The Penitential Tyrant, Appendix 291 FF. The list of subscribers is mutilated in the copy found in the Boston Public Library. The Penitential Tyrant, although written in response to a midnight vision of a somewhat thrilling nature, footnote 1, is much less interesting than its title would lead one to expect. It has no definiteness of purpose, and but little distinct anti-slavery sentiment in its lines, which are mainly of a religious character. It is on Brannigan's prose that his claim to be ranked among anti-slavery writers must rest. Here he deals with the subject in its moral, political, and economic aspects with some incoherence but plenty of vigor. He addresses the legislature of South Carolina on the subject of the slave trade. Footnote 2. He urges on the northern states an amendment of the federal constitution abolishing the 3/5 ratio of representation, which, as long as it exists, he says, will prevent the South from giving up slavery or the slave trade. Footnote 3. He suggests that Congress undertake the immediate amelioration of the condition of the slaves. Footnote 4. And he follows the policy of Anthony Benezet in suggesting the colonization of the Negroes in the Western Territory. Footnote 5. When, in 1849, Joshua R. Giddings set forth his vigorous doctrine that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and urged Congress to exercise its powers against slavery, he probably did not know that more than 40 years earlier another had trodden the same path. John Parrish, writing at about the same time as Thomas Brannigan, and under the influence of the same political conditions, was a man of very different character and antecedents. He was a native of Baltimore County, Maryland, and a member of the Society of Friends. Footnote 6. Though advanced in years when he published his Remarks on the Slavery of the Black People, 1806, he has all the vigor and uncompromising morality of youth. In his charity of heart and keenness of vision, he reminds one of John Woolman. He is no man's enemy, and would do a kindness even to a slaveholder. He does not wish to call down fire from heaven to destroy the wicked. Yet he feels, as was felt during the French and Indian War and the Revolution, footnote 1, that the judgment of the Lord is at hand. Footnote 1. Brannigan, The Penitential Tyrant, Canto 2, pages 71-81. Footnote 2. Ibidem, a preliminary essay, 211-220. Footnote 3. Ibidem, Serious Remonstrances, 13, 14, 27-31. Political Disquisition, 54-56, 59-63. Footnote 4. Ibidem, a preliminary essay, 220-223. Footnote 5. Ibidem, Serious Remonstrances, 17-22, 35-64. Footnote 6. Appleton, Encyclopedia. Judgments, indeed, are already following South Carolina's apostasy in regard to the slave trade. Since the rights of man have been investigated, people can no longer plead ignorance, and the continuance of slavery, in spite of the Declaration of Independence and the State Bills of Rights, must lead to further visitations of the Almighty. Footnote 2. Like the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, in its memorial of 1790, he regards slavery as contrary not only to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, but to those of the Constitution, as stated in the preamble. For, he argues, to deprive the colored people of the rights which have been proclaimed would not form a more perfect union or ensure domestic tranquility. And nothing, he adds, can be more contrary to the blessing of liberty than to make them liable to unconditional bondage, without the consoling prospect of ever being redeemed therefrom. The Constitution, he declares further, affirms the validity of all engagements entered into before its adoption, and the Declaration of the Universal Right to Liberty he regards as such a pledge. Since these are the principles of the Constitution, he argues, any expression in such a document, calculated to admit of partial construction or a different meaning in order to enslave a particular race of men, would be ignoble, and any act of legislation by which slavery is countenanced would be a perversion of the fundamental principles of government. Footnote 3. With equal vigor, he declares that the only sure basis of good government is the principle of the Golden Rule. Footnote 4. And that no government is secure in which one half of the citizens trample upon the rights of the other half. In one splendid sentence, he anticipates by half a century the prophecy of Abraham Lincoln. A house divided against itself, says Parrish, cannot stand. Neither can a government or constitution. Footnote 5. Lincoln's use of the scriptural figure is more effective than the earlier authors, for he not only hits the nail on the head, but drives it home. Lincoln, moreover, is referring to a sectional division with the expectation not that the house will fall, not that the Union will be dissolved, but that it will become either all slave or all free. Parrish is referring to the race problem, and his idea of the issue is based on a religious conviction that the cry of the oppressed will be heard. Footnote 1. Parrish remarks on the slavery of the black people, 1-7. Footnote 2. Ibidem 39-40. Footnote 3. Ibidem 8-9. Footnote 4. Ibidem 14. Footnote 5. Ibidem 9. There is a God that judgeth in the earth, is the continual cry of this Jeremiah. There is a curse upon the house that is builded by unrighteousness. Footnote 1. God's justice cannot sleep forever, and we cannot hope for the long continuance of his blessing upon a government which neglects or refuses its duty in respect to these people. Footnote 2. All the combinations of human policy, he believes, shall not be able to prevent the deliverance of these people from their wretched state of thraldom. Footnote 3. The day is hastening when these people will become free, and it is desirable it should be with the consent of those who have authority over them. Footnote 4. Parrish not only realizes the seriousness of the situation, but has a keen eye for specific abuses and suggests definite remedies. He protests against the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793. He declares that the domestic as well as the foreign slave trade must cease, and suggests that the state legislatures might prohibit transportation through their respective territories. Footnote 5. Not only must further importation be prohibited at the earliest possible moment, but something must be done to relieve those already under the lash, and that can be begun at once. Footnote 6. He suggests that Congress, which had power to make laws for the oppression of the slave, as in 1793, is surely competent also to ameliorate his condition, and that the District of Columbia would be a suitable place to begin. Footnote 7. He argues in favor of emancipation on economic as well as moral and political grounds, and like Brannigan advocates a scheme of colonization in the West, where he fondly imagines that there are millions of acres likely to continue many ages unoccupied. Footnote 8. After the sentimental platitudes of the magazines, the weak optimism of most of the occasional orators, the political acrimony of the Federalist writers, and the incoherent extravagances of the penitential tyrant, it is refreshing to find a man so fair-minded and reasonable, so sure-sighted and so far-seeing, so prompt and practical in his action. Footnote 1. Parrish, Remarks on the Slavery of the Black People, 29. Footnote 2. Ibidem 24. Footnote 3. Ibidem 7. Footnote 4. Ibidem 41. Footnote 5. Ibidem 31. Footnote 6. Ibidem 39. Footnote 7. Ibidem 15. Compare section 175 above. Footnote 8. Ibidem 23-25. 43. No other writer of his time has grasped the whole situation so thoroughly or dealt with it so effectively. An examination of the anti-slavery arguments of this period shows little that is new, since the fundamental principles had already been established. The inconsistency of slavery with the teachings of Scripture is still urged, footnote 1, though much less conspicuously than its inconsistency with the principles and professions of the American Revolution. The moral argument of the degrading effects of slavery on both master and slave is often repeated on the same lines as in the earlier period. Slavery, it is said, destroys all sense of moral rectitude and natural justice. Footnote 2. It debases and contaminates the immortal soul, as well as torments and lacerates the mortal body. Footnote 3. It necessitates inhumanity. Footnote 4. It deprives the Negro of the social and domestic relations favorable to the practice of virtue. Footnote 5. Idleness is a result of slavery, and idleness is the nurse of vice. Footnote 6. On the whole, says Theodore Dwight, every species of wickedness results from slavery, wherever it exists. Footnote 7. Although in this period the rights of man began to suffer some eclipse on account of the excesses of the French Revolution, it is still the principles of 1776 that stimulate the anti-slavery writers to greatest enthusiasm. Footnote 8. Slavery is regarded by them as a monument of the tyranny and inconsistency of human governments. Footnote 1. Footnote 1. Crawford, Observations upon Negro Slavery, 3-14, 13. Dana, The African Slave Trade, 5-12, 26-30. Edwards, The Injustice and Impolicy of the Slave Trade and Slavery, 13-18. Hopkins, Discourse upon the Slave Trade and Slavery of the Africans, in Hopkins, Works, 11, 600-604. Buchanan, Oration upon the Moral and Political Evil of Slavery, 9-15. Footnote 2. Brannigan, Serious Remonstrances, 58. Footnote 3. Ibidem, 32. Footnote 4. Tucker, Dissertation on Slavery, 48-65. Footnote 5. A Free Negro, Letter on Slavery, in the American Museum, 679. Footnote 6. Rice, Slavery Inconsistent with Justice and Good Policy, 10. Footnote 7. Dwight, Oration before the Connecticut Society, 16. For comments on the effects of slavery on the character, see also Morse, American Geography, 65-66, 352-353, 388-391, 432-433. Webster, Effects of Slavery on Morals and Industry, 6-14, 18-22. Sutcliffe, Travels in Some Parts of North America, 71-72. Edwards, The Injustice and Impolicy of the Slave Trade and Slavery, 10-12. The American Museum, 7, 72-73. Imlay, A Topographical Description of the Western Territory of North America, 58. Miller, Discourse before the New York Society, 24-28. Footnote 8. Dwight, Oration before the Connecticut Society, 8-13, 23-24. Pinckney, Speech in the House of Delegates of Maryland, 6-8. Buchanan, Oration. Upon the Moral and Political Evil of Slavery, 7-14. Tucker, Dissertation on Slavery, 9-11, 27-30, 50. Imlay, A Topographical Description of the Western Territory, 222. It will not do, says William Pinckney in his oration before the Maryland House of Delegates in 1789, thus to talk like philosophers and act like unrelenting tyrants, to be perpetually sermonizing it with liberty for our text and actual oppression for our commentary. Footnote 2. Can Americans so soon forget their principles, asks Othello, and, after the noble contempt they expressed for tyrants, meanly descend to take up the scourge? Footnote 3. The same sentiment appears in pictorial form in the frontispiece of Brannigan's Evania. Here the goddess of liberty is represented as seated in her temple, which is supported by columns inscribed with the names of appropriate virtues, and is gazing mournfully on a band of African slaves, who, as the author explains, are brought to view in order to demonstrate the hypocrisy and villainy of professing to be votaries of liberty, while, at the same time, we encourage or countenance the most ignoble slavery. Footnote 4. This argument is forcibly presented in the remarkable oration of Dr. George Buchanan, July 4, 1791. Deceitful men, who could have suggested that American patriotism would this day countenance a conduct so inconsistent, that while America boasts of being a land of freedom and an asylum for the oppressed of Europe, she should at the same time foster an abominable nursery for slaves, to check the shoots of her glorious liberty. Cruel and oppressive, she wantonly abuses the rights of man, and willingly sacrifices her liberty at the altar of slavery. What an opportunity is here given for triumph among her enemies! Will they not exclaim that upon this very day, while the Americans celebrate the anniversary of freedom and independence, abject slavery exists in all her states but one? Footnote 5. In Denny's Portfolio, 1803, Fraternal, a Virginia planter, is represented as abandoning the rehearsal of a speech on liberty and equality in order to beat a slave. Footnote 1. Footnote 1. Rice, Slavery Inconsistent with Justice and Good Policy, 8-9. Footnote 2. Pinckney, Speech in the House of Delegates of Maryland, 8. Footnote 3. Othello, Essay on Negro Slavery, No. 1, in the American Museum, 415. Footnote 4. The picture is described in Brannigan, The Penitential Tyrant, 3. Footnote 5. Buchanan, Oration upon the Moral and Political Evil of Slavery, 13. By this time, the doctrines of Jefferson had become unpopular among the Federalists, and it was said even at the North that the Negroes had become less industrious and less prosperous since their heads had been turned by the modern jargon of liberty and the rights of man. Footnote 2. But except among violent partisans, these principles remained the favorite argument against slavery. The light, as John Parrish said, had been set upon the candlestick where all men could see it. Footnote 3. The phrases of the Declaration of Independence were the handwriting on the wall, and woe to those who failed to regard it. Footnote 4. Besides the general argument from the inalienable rights of man, there are often special arguments on the natural equality of the Negroes, using this term in a less restricted sense than when it was defined by the philosopher of the English Revolution. Footnote 5. The common humanity of blacks and whites is argued in language that recalls Franklin's adaptation of Shylock. Footnote 6. Differences of color and other physical distinctions, if they proved anything, argues Brannigan, would prove too much. Footnote 7. The somewhat equivocal position of Thomas Jefferson on this question arouses a native of the Virginia back country, Gilbert Imlay, to champion the cause of the Negro. Mr. Jefferson asks, says Imlay, if the difference of color is of no real importance. I answer that it is of no real importance when compared with the object of rescuing some millions of miserable human beings from the odious prejudices which have degraded a whole race of men to the rank of beasts of burden because they had the misfortune not to have the tinge of red and white. Footnote 8. Footnote 1. The Portfolio, 3, 245 to 246. Footnote 2. Ibidem, 1, 163 to 164. Footnote 3. Parrish, Remarks on the Slavery of the Black People, 2 to 3. Footnote 4. Luther Richardson, Address before the Roxbury Charitable Society, September 17, 1804, in the Monthly Analogy, 1, 609. Footnote 5. Natural equality is defined by John Locke as a state wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another. Locke, Essay Concerning the True Original, Extent, and End of Civil Government, Chapter 2. Footnote 6. Franklin, Essay on the Slave Trade, 5. See also Crawford, Observations upon Negro Slavery, 4. A Free Negro, Letter on Slavery, in the American Museum, 678. Footnote 7. Brannigan, A Preliminary Essay, 96 to 100. Footnote 8. Imlay, A Topographical Description of the Western Territory, 225 to 226. See also Pinckney, Speech in the House of Delegates of Maryland, 15 to 17. Dana, The African Slave Trade, 28 to 29. Rice, Slavery Inconsistent with Justice and Good Policy, 4 to 6. Buchanan, Oration upon the Moral and Political Evil of Slavery, 7. Swift, Oration on Domestic Slavery, 11. As for equality of mental powers, the general inferiority which exists is regarded, as in the Revolutionary period, as the effect of slavery. Jefferson's discriminations against the Negro call forth another indignant response. One would have thought, says a reviewer of the Notes on Virginia in 1804, that modern philosophy himself could not have the face to declare that the wretch who was driven out to labor at the dawn of day, and who toils until evening with the whip flourishing over his head, ought to be a poet. Footnote 1. The Negro poetess, Phyllis Wheatley, is still quoted as an instance of the natural ability of the race. Footnote 2. In other cases of exceptional talent, such as Benjamin Banneker and Thomas Fuller, the phenomenal calculators are occasionally brought forward. Footnote 3. The political arguments on the destructiveness of slavery to Republican institutions, and perhaps to the very existence of the Republic, are much the same as in the Revolutionary period, though with new illustrations drawn from the events of the passing years. That reverence for liberty, which is the vital principle of a republic, says William Pinckney, will be destroyed. Footnote 4. Liberty and peace, says Theodore Dwight, can never flourish on the bleak and barren soil of slavery. Footnote 5. Our free institutions, writes Othello, are only painted sepulchres, containing within them naught but rottenness and corruption. Footnote 6. Slavery, says Brannigan, is to the body politic what a yellow fever or a galloping consumption is to an individual body. And every slave ship that arrives at Charleston is to our nation what the Grecians' wooden horse was to Troy. Footnote 1. Observations upon certain passages in Mr. Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, in The Portfolio, 4, 251 to 252, 268. On this subject, see also Imlay, A Topographical Description of the Western Territory, 227 to 228. Brannigan, A Preliminary Essay, 100 to 110. Footnote 2. Imlay, A Topographical Description, 228. Crawford, Observations upon Negro Slavery, 5 to 7. Note. See above, page 56, note. Footnote 3. Accounts communicated by Dr. Rush, published by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in the American Museum, 5, 61 to 63. An account of Benjamin Banneker by James Mahenry, Ibidem, 12, 185 to 187. Brannigan, A Preliminary Essay, 102 to 108. Brissett, New Travels in the United States, 1, 241 to 243. Footnote 4. Pinckney, Speech in the Maryland House of Delegates, 9. Footnote 5. Dwight, Oration before the Connecticut Society, 24. Footnote 6. Othello, Essay on Negro Slavery in the American Museum, 4, 511. The insurrection in St. Domingo furnished a fruitful text for the anti-slavery Jeremiads, at the same time that it intensified the reluctance of the Southern states to increase the number of free blacks, and the possibilities of domestic insurrection and even of a dissolution of the Union were, as has already been seen, touched upon with an unsparing hand. Listen to the warnings of the Maryland orator, Dr. George Buchanan, on this point. Hark! Methinks I hear the work begun. The blacks have already sought for allies and found them in the wilderness. They have called the rusty savages to their assistance, and are preparing to take revenge of their haughty masters. A revenge which they consider as justly merited for being no longer able to endure their unnatural and unlawful bondage. They are determined to seek liberty or death. Another aspect of the subject is treated by Dr. Buchanan with equal earnestness. Slavery, the most implacable enemy of your country, threatens you with destruction. Already has it disturbed the limpid stream of liberty. It has polluted the minds of your youth, sown the seeds of despotism, and without a speedy check to her ravages, will sink you into a pit of infamy, where you shall be robbed of all the honors you have before acquired. End of section 16.
Section 17, Chapter 8 of Anti-Slavery in America, from the Introduction of African Slaves to the Prohibition of the Slave Trade, 1619 to 1808. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Linda Sonrisa Jones. Anti-Slavery in America, from the Introduction of African Slaves to the Prohibition of the Slave Trade, 1619 to 1808, by Mary Stoughton Locke. Chapter 8, Anti-Slavery Literature After the Revolution, 1783 to 1808, Section 2. To the argument of vested rights, the anti-slavery writers address themselves resolutely, and rights of property in the slave are as vehemently denied as by the old-time Quakers. The old Puritan idea of slavery as a permissible result of captivity in war is now entirely exploded. Slavery as a punishment for crime is the only possibility admitted at all, and this but seldom. No man can have a property in stolen goods, says Charles Crawford in his Observation upon Negro Slavery in 1784. And it is immaterial whether a man or his ancestors or the persons of whom they were bought stole the goods. One man can never become the property of another, says Thomas Brannigan, following a different line of thought, till the latter become more and the former less than a man. Theodore Dwight, too, declares such property impossible in any situation or under the authority of any laws. If that right existed, says Jonathan Edwards, there would be no reason why the skins and teeth of Negroes should not be taken for sale as well as those of elephants, if only they were equally valuable. By David Rice, the slave owners are regarded as licensed robbers, not as just proprietors, and their claims as entitled to no respect. The claim to compensation, even if it were valid, reasons Theodore Dwight, would still be a distinct question from that of giving the slave his liberty, the latter of which admits of no doubt whatever. The owner may not even plead the dangers of emancipation, says Dr. Edwards, any more than a robber may murder the man he has robbed in order that he may have a better chance for his own life. The master's suffering, in any case, Rice reminds his hearers, is the result not of the emancipation of the slave, but of the conditions produced by the existence of slavery, and even though there should be undeserved loss, he asks, "Is nobody entitled to justice but slaveholders?" The necessities of climate received comparatively little attention. "A thing radically wrong," said John Parrish, "will not admit of such fig-leaf coverings." The impossibility of carrying on a plantation without Negro labor was doubted, and in any case the importance of the work was regarded as subordinate to the interests of humanity, justice, and religion. Thomas Brannigan believed that the free Negroes, if kindly treated, would work as they did at the North, and that their masters would gain rather than lose by the change. But in general, the possibility that free Negroes might do the work as well as slaves seems to have received little consideration. In fact, even some zealous emancipationists were appalled at the prospect of idleness, famine, and vice which would follow the sudden abolition of slavery. St. George Tucker pictured the freed blacks as the caterpillars of the earth and the tigers of the human race, and the general opinion evidently was that the dreaded disasters attendant upon a free black population must be avoided by some safe and gradual means of emancipation still to be discovered. In this period appeared a more prominent and elaborate statement of the economic effects of slavery than ever before. The great lexicographer, Noah Webster, writing in a scientific spirit and believing that the most effective appeal is to self-interest, devoted his attention especially to this aspect of the question. Other authors, too, urged the economic arguments with more appreciation of their real importance than had been shown in earlier times, except by Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Rush. The unprofitableness of slave labor to both the slaveholder and the community was perhaps more fully realized at this time than either earlier or later. Before this, economic principles were not so carefully considered, and economic differences between the free and slave states were not sufficiently developed to point the moral, while afterwards the realms of King Cotton were colored by a glow of apparent prosperity which disguised the real disadvantages of the system. Nevertheless, at the time under consideration, slavery was not yet regarded as a positive good. In Maryland and Virginia, it was admitted to be unprofitable. It was argued that land in the free states was worth more than that of the same quality in the South, and the labor of a free man was said to be worth twice that of a slave. Experiments in the use of free labor were tried in the Shenandoah Valley and on the eastern shore of Virginia with apparent success, although ultimately only to prove that free and slave labor cannot exist on the same soil. The greater cost of slave labor in proportion to the product was so well understood by John Randolph that he confessed that but few productions would bear the expense. Noah Webster, from an elaborate comparison of the advantages of free and slave labor in their effects on the cost of production, the relative value of land, and the amount of exports, draws similar conclusions, noting that the annual product of the South is much less than that of the North in proportion to the population. And he goes still further in asserting that the most luxuriant soil and most salubrious climate are advantages which in no country counterbalance the tendency of slavery to weaken and impoverish a country. These conclusions were supplemented by the observations of travelers who did not fail to comment on the differences between the free and slave states. John Parrish, too, speaks of the worn-out soil, the destruction of timber, the broken fences, saying, "The land is made barren by the wickedness of those that dwell therein." The effects on density of population are noticed in some detail by Noah Webster and Jonathan Edwards. The dishonoring of labor, the consequent lack of industry, and the waste arising from a large number of unemployed are also subjects of comment. When slavery becomes common, says Reverend David Rice, industry sinks into disgrace. To labor is to slave, to work is to work like a Negro, and as labor becomes dishonored, he adds, poverty and crime take its place. The effects of slavery upon the development of commerce and manufactures received some attention from Webster, but elsewhere were hardly touched upon, and that aspect of the subject was probably little understood. Manufactures were still in their infancy, and the differences which were to arise in respect to the density of population, the character and variety of industries, and the accumulation of wealth could hardly be dreamed of. Although it is impossible to make a chronological division on this basis, it may be said in general that the earlier writers of the period were radiant with hope and courage, and that as years passed without any progress in those regions where it might naturally be looked for next, the note of warning was more frequently sounded, and suggestions were offered for the sake of relieving the conscience of the writer rather than with any hope of their adoption. Among the more sanguine, it was believed that the American Revolution was the beginning of political liberty for the whole world, and that, the march of freedom once begun, nothing but the arm of omnipotence can prevent it from reaching the miserable Africans. To some it seemed hardly necessary to make any further effort, as so much had already been accomplished. Reverend James Dana in 1790 notes the progress made during the previous 20 years and asks, could wisdom and philanthropy have advanced further for this time? Even to Jonathan Edwards, who was not a man to shrink from vigorous exertion, it seemed in 1791 that at the present rate of progression it would within 50 years be as shameful for a man to hold a Negro slave as to be guilty of common robbery or theft. Noah Webster, after his historical and statistical researches, is less hopeful. Judging by the history of villanage in Europe, he thinks, it will be about 2 centuries before slavery is naturally extinguished. James Sullivan, in writing to Dr. Belknap, takes a similar view. The time required for emancipation, he thinks, must be as extensive, at least, as that in which slavery has been endured here. Others, no less energetic, take a still more gloomy view and dwell less on the prospect of emancipation than on the retribution which is awaiting the nation and particularly the slaveholders, unless emancipation is speedily accomplished. Thomas Brannigan, for instance, warns his readers that the scourge of God is now shaking over the American Commonwealth. Many are the abominations, says John Parrish, which draw down divine displeasure and bring judgments on lands and on individuals, but nothing appears to me equal nor fraught with so many evils as enslaving our fellow men. Reverend Samuel Hopkins, who felt in 1776 that the war had been sent by Providence to show the nation its sin, and that a happy issue could not be expected without previous repentance and reform, feels again in 1787 that the hand of God is upon the country. The suppression of the slave trade, he says, has carried the colonies through the Revolution, but by continuing to hold the Negroes in bondage and by the renewal of the slave trade, the country has forfeited the favor of the Almighty, and another visitation of Providence has been necessary. The nation, he affirms, is not prospering. It is despised by European powers. There is discontent and anarchy and insurrection at home. Especially marked are the disasters of Rhode Island, the headquarters of the reviving slave trade. The hand of God is again upon the country, urging to repentance and reform. The dangers of insurrection, as has already been noted, furnish a particularly fruitful field for the prophets of impending destruction. As for the slaveholders themselves, nothing less than eternal sufferings, thinks Othello, can make adequate retribution for their offenses, and at the day of judgment the oppressor will be forced to dart deeper into the flames in order to avoid the just reproaches of his former slaves. The same consoling thought inspires the verses of The Penitential Tyrant. Soon, soon, that God his justice will display, and chase oppressors from the face of day, hurled down to hell by heaven's almighty sire, transfixed with vengeance and involved in fire. Of the possible remedies for slavery, none was neglected in the writings of this period. The members of the Society of Friends had done little beyond accomplishing emancipation throughout their own sect and urging individual manumission outside. The revolutionists had begun to apply to the state, and their work was accomplished through that agency. Now that the efforts for political action had spent their strength, nearly every anti-slavery writer seems to have some pet scheme for encountering or avoiding the prejudice, timidity, or avarice which left the work of the emancipation still incomplete. The individual projects of this period are therefore more definite and more elaborate than those of the previous one, as well as of greater variety. Various halfway measures were urged, either as palliatives to the lot of the slave or as appeals to the self-interest of the master. It was hoped that the abolition of the slave trade, together with a mitigation of the lot of the slave and a gradual improvement in the relation between him and his master, would by and by make emancipation a safe and natural process. Proposals were therefore made for legislation in regard to the treatment of the slave, granting him some time to himself and providing for his instruction. Several enthusiastic accounts appeared of an arrangement said to be in operation in the Spanish West Indies, where the slave was allowed to work 1 day in the week for wages, with the privilege of buying his other days, and so gradually working out his freedom. Another idea, according to Abbé Bonnet, was to sell all the slaves to the planters of the West Indies. A favorite scheme was to make slavery unprofitable by the refusal to buy or use the produce of slave labor. The consumption of sugar in Philadelphia was perceptibly diminished at one time by the qualmishness of some of the Quakers. At about the same time, the sugar maple came into great favor as the probable means of destroying slavery. I cannot help contemplating a sugar maple tree with a species of affection and even veneration, writes Dr. Rush, for I have persuaded myself to behold in it the happy means of rendering the commerce and slavery of our African brethren in the sugar islands as unnecessary as it has always been inhuman and unjust. Brissot de Warville, then traveling in America, and later as a leader in the French Revolution, to be identified with the emancipation of slaves in the French colonies, writes with equal confidence and enthusiasm. A society was organized for the special purpose of encouraging this movement. Estimates were made of the capacity of the trees of New York and Pennsylvania to supply the demands of the United States, and it was calculated that 263,000 acres of trees would serve the purpose. Thomas Jefferson, at this hopeful period, is said to have planted an orchard of sugar maples and to have used no other sugar in his family. Good Abbé Bonnet, in America at about this time, indulges in pleasant anticipations of the effects of this sugar culture upon the future deliberations of Congress. Although humanity itself prescribed delays, he says, the triumph of liberty is none the less decreed by nature, for in 15 years Congress will have to declare itself in regard to the liberty of the Negroes, and what can it reply to them when, each bearing in his hand a branch of the sugar maple, they shall come to say to it, "Look and read upon this leaf the decree of nature. We were enslaved in order to cultivate the sugar cane." What can it reply, I say, but you are free? The slaves unfortunately did not appear in the halls of Congress with their branches of sugar maple, and the beautiful tree which was to destroy slavery was soon overshadowed by the gigantic proportions of the cotton plant. The free produce movement was taken up by the abolition societies and never wholly died out. In 1807, Thomas Brannigan calls on all Christians, particularly Methodists and Quakers, to unite against buying and using the price and produce of human blood. The American Convention of Delegates of the Abolition Societies makes an appeal to the same effect. It is said that the number of those who have joined in the movement is large and is increasing daily, and that, no bonds can be assigned to its future progress. And although the movement disappointed the hopes of its originators in the achievement of definite results, it must, as in later anti-slavery movement, have had considerable moral influence. Suggestions for measures of emancipation in the South were very much along the lines that had already proved practicable in the North, though it was impossible to overlook the difference of conditions in states having large numbers of slaves. The remedy of colonization was now distinctly brought forward. Individual manumission was insisted on by Jonathan Edwards as absolutely and immediately obligatory. Legislative action, however, was regarded as altogether the most promising resource, and the chief problem was to overcome the opposition of those who would suffer immediate loss by the measure. The most important efforts in this direction have already been described. Among minor suggestions were that of Dr. Buchanan for the emancipation of 1 or 2 generations at a certain age, and the bolder one of Othello for immediate abolition with a provision for colonizing the freed Negroes in some place west of the Alleghanies. The greatest difficulties which the abolitionists had to contend with were connected with the free Negroes, and no scheme of emancipation which left them out of account could hope for success in the states where there was a large Negro population. Even the abolitionists generally admitted the unfitness of the blacks for freedom, though contending that this was no argument for continuing to hold them in slavery, but rather the reverse. Emancipation, it was thought, was no less a duty because it was not the whole duty, but it must be supplemented by other measures. The Negroes must at least be taught to take care of themselves and to obey the laws of the country. There were, however, social and political distinctions even in Massachusetts, and it was supposed that the full enjoyment of equal rights and liberties was practically impossible, and that there could never be any real harmony of interests. The degradation of the blacks, as well as custom and prejudice among the whites, would prevent such a united community. The generous loyalty of the African American had not yet been tested, and the free Negro was expected to resent his own past injuries and those of his race to such an extent as to be a source of danger to the Commonwealth, even more serious than when he was a slave. All these difficulties, it was hoped, might be met by colonization. This had been a favorite idea of Dr. Hopkins ever since 1773, when he and President Stiles undertook the education of some promising young colored men who were to act as leaders in establishing a colony in Africa. The enterprise received some financial aid from churches in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, and from London and Edinburgh, but the establishment of the colony was prevented by the Revolutionary War. Meanwhile, Jefferson and other leading Virginians had taken up the idea, and a plan was proposed by Jefferson providing for the previous instruction of the Negroes in agriculture and various handicrafts, the equipment of the colonists, and arrangements for their support and defense until they should be able to take care of themselves. After the close of the Revolutionary War, Dr. Hopkins renewed his efforts for the execution of his scheme, and Dr. William Thornton volunteered to act as a leader of the enterprise. The colony of Sierra Leone, derived partly from Hopkins' ideas, was founded in 1787 by Granville Sharp and other English philanthropists, and as Dr. Thornton failed to secure sufficient funds for his own undertaking, efforts were made for a combination with the English colony. In regard to this project, Dr. Hopkins corresponded with Granville Sharp and Zachary Macaulay. He also tried to obtain aid from the state legislatures and the abolition societies. Although he was never able to carry out his scheme, he never abandoned it, and the Liberia of a later day may justly look upon him as first among its founders. In 1790, a Plan for Liberating the Negroes within the United States was published in the American Museum by Mr. Ferdinando Fairfax. It was here proposed that Congress should make a plan for African colonization on a national scale along the lines already proposed by Jefferson for Virginia. The insurrection in Virginia in 1800 revived the project again in that state, and for several years efforts toward colonization were made, President Jefferson taking a prominent part. Plans for colonization in the West, however, were often regarded as more feasible than the African scheme. It was proposed that a tract of the unoccupied land should be allotted to the free Negroes by Congress, with conditions similar to those suggested by Jefferson. In the earlier proposals, this land was vaguely located west of the Alleghenies. After the purchase of Louisiana, the location was transferred to that region. The land, according to one plan, was to be sold at moderate terms, on credit, to Africans only who had been brought up as farmers. Funds were to be raised in the various states for the accommodation of emigrants and their equipment with the necessary outfit. The blacks already free were to go first, and it was expected that voluntary manumission would go on rapidly when the problem became simplified in this way. One sanguine writer even thought that emancipation might be almost instantly realized. Objections to the colonization schemes were raised. Then, as later, on account of the expense, the length of time required, the mischievousness of a plan which would involve such delay, and the injustice to the Negroes deported, especially if they should be sent to Africa. It was considered unwise, too, to banish the whole laboring class from the Southern states. It had been thought that the free blacks would not work, but it was evident that somebody must. This policy was compared to the expulsion of the Moors from Spain, and dire famine was predicted if such a measure could be carried out. Jefferson had proposed that the place of the Negro should be filled by soliciting emigration from Europe, but here, too, there were practical difficulties. Even the plan of St. George Tucker for inducing the voluntary emigration of the freedmen by restricting their rights and privileges at home would share in these disadvantages. For these reasons, it seemed to some writers more practicable, as well as more just, to arrange for some system of overseers or of tenant farming, by which the Negroes could be kept under supervision, at least during the transition period. One plan was for the appointment of overseers from among the Negroes themselves to look after the conduct of the rest and report to the proper authorities. Incapable or vicious Negroes were to be placed out for a year or other term, as was done in the case of whites. Another plan was to raise the Negroes gradually to the condition of free tenants. The most promising should be taken first, and equipped with tools and other necessaries, and assistance and guidance should be given until they learned to manage their own farms. According to still another suggestion, the slave might receive a portion of the waste lands which were so plentiful among the plantations, and bring it under cultivation for himself, although he should still for a term of years or even for life be attached to the soil and held responsible by his master. The next generation in this case might be free at the age of 25. This arrangement was intended to give time for the reclaiming of the wasteland and the training of the Negroes to self-dependence, and was expected to leave the proprietors better off than before through the greater productiveness of the system. At the same time, there would be opportunity, in case the Negroes proved unequal to the occasion, for the importation of European emigrants. All these schemes, well as they looked on paper, had very little chance of showing how they would actually work. To the South, however, much the existence of slavery might be regretted, emancipation seemed impossible, though ever so gradual, if the blacks were to remain in the country. Even the slightest allusion to the subject was beginning to arouse suspicion or fear, and measures or even phrases which had the remotest connection with the Negro were regarded as offensive because they were likely to affect that species of property. Mr. Randolph's excitement because slaves might not be carried from one port to another in vessels of less than 40 tons, and Mr. Early's declaration that if the Negroes illegally imported were allowed to go free, not one of them would be left alive within a year, sufficiently illustrate the situation. Looking back over the period, it may seem at first one of promise unfulfilled. In the light of later events, the good that was done is overshadowed by what was left undone. It is necessary to realize the conditions of the time in order to estimate fairly the progress made since James Otis asserted the rights of the British colonies. When the Declaration of Independence was adopted, there was not a foot of free soil in the country. The blacks in the South had been regarded as a source of danger for nearly a century, yet their numbers had been continually increasing. The history of St. Domingo in the years immediately following the adoption of the Constitution was not an incentive to the citizens of a still unstable and very experimental government to attempt an additional experiment in the way of emancipation. That the blacks would work in a state of freedom, that they could be peaceful, useful, and law-abiding citizens, and that the productiveness of a free South would be greater than was ever possible under a system of slavery could be known only by actual experience. With visions of famine, fire, and massacre, of all the possible horrors of an insurrection by a barbarous people situated at their very hearthsides and burning for revenge, with the daily spectacle of the difficulties of obtaining a reasonable amount of labor from the Negro, even by constant oversight and severe discipline, it is not to be wondered at that the slaveholders of the South could arrive at emancipation only at the point of the sword. Yet whatever the difficulties of emancipation, there never was a time when it could not have been accomplished with more ease and less disaster than was the case in the final crisis of the Civil War. It was only because avarice and timidity, selfishness and sloth, at the North as well as at the South, had combined to tie the knot tighter and tighter, that only the sword could finally loose it. Gradual abolition became more and more impossible, and a voice must cry, "Emancipation, total, universal, and immediate," before the end could come. Abolitionists of the earlier day had seen the truth as clearly and spoken it as boldly as any of the later generation. If their language was usually more temperate, it was not from timidity or indifference, but because they believed that persuasion was more effective than provocation. They did what they could to save their country from the doom which they foresaw, and it was not the insufficiency of their zeal nor the defects of their organization that made it impossible to avert that doom. A democracy must move slowly. The masses cannot keep the pace of the leaders. An intelligent autocrat or an enlightened and patriotic aristocracy might have put an end to slavery much more easily than was done by the great mass of the American people through their representatives in 1865. But the toilsome paths by which a great people have been led upward have been through fields of promise that would not have been open to the citizens of an oligarchy or an autocracy. The abolition of slavery in America has been accomplished through the political, economic, and moral education of the whole nation, and its history will be a lesson, a warning, and an inspiration as long as the nation endures. Honor to those who led the movement and pointed out the way. Their schemes for universal emancipation were looked upon as impracticable. Their exhortations and warnings fell for the most part on unlistening ears. Nevertheless, they accomplished the prohibition of the slave trade, the establishment of universal liberty in the northern states, the regulation of territorial slavery by Congress, and the custom of petitioning for further legislation. They formed the abolition societies and propagated anti-slavery ideas through their agency. They produced a constant outpour of anti-slavery pamphlets, orations, and newspaper and magazine articles. In these ways, they laid the foundation of the work of Lundy and Garrison and the anti-slavery societies, and made possible the petitions presented by John Quincy Adams and the development of the Liberty, Free Soil, and Republican parties. End of Chapter 8. End of Anti-Slavery in America, from the Introduction of African Slaves to the Prohibition of the Slave Trade, 1619 to 1808, by Mary Stoughton Locke.